Thank you. At the next slide, the video. It is. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Before we formally start the proceedings, I just want to quickly go through some housekeeping. So due to COVID-19 regulations, we are running a hybrid event today with physical attendance within this auditorium restricted. And I would just encourage people to be mindful and to consider social distancing and to wear a mask. In case of fire, those of you at the back, please make your way out of the upstairs doors, and those of you towards the front of the auditorium, please make your way out towards your left at the bottom. The restrooms are well signposted and they're towards the top. And I can't believe I've got to say this one, but smoking is not permitted in the building. All presentations will be recorded, so by being part of the audience or being one of the presenters, you are giving your consent to allow that recording to take place. All speakers, award recipients, and chairs, please stay at the end of the proceedings for some photographs. And due to the tight schedule, there will be no Q&A, but if you do have any questions for the speakers, please collar them at the end and ask them your questions. Okay, so welcome to the 23rd Annual MARTA Research Showcase, an event that showcases to the community the work that we do. I'd like to particularly thank our valued guests who've attended today from the wider MARTA community, including Francis Sullivan, AO, the chair of the MARTA board, Virginia Ryan, the chair of the MARTA Foundation, Dr. Peter Steer, the chief executive officer, Sister Sandra Lupi, and Andrew Thomas, and all other board and executive members in attendance. Our welcome is also extended to Professor Scott Bell, Professor Paul Clark, to Associate Professor John Burke and Sister Anne Hetherington, and other members of the MARTA Research Advisory Board, chaired by Carrie Hilliard, AM. Soon we will have a welcome to country from Songwoman Biringa, but I'd also like to add my own acknowledgement to elders past, present, and emerging on the lands that we are gathered here today of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. But firstly, before continuing with my own address, I'd like to show you a short video that gives you an idea of who we are. Thank you.
At MARTA Research, we ask the questions so we can find the answers that save lives. Our MARTA researchers are focused on improving health across all of life stages, with 5 research arms: mother and baby health, healthcare delivery and innovation, cancer, neuroscience, and chronic and integrated care.
Our programs work together to find, translate, and integrate new treatments, diagnoses, and models of care. This helps members of our community to help shape policy and health service delivery, both nationally and internationally.
Since 1998, MARTA Research has been working closely with MARTA Health's Hospital and Health Services and MARTA Education, with many of our researchers also working as clinicians and educators at MARTA. This positions us to be able to truly deliver our scientific discoveries from the bench to the bedside. We are also closely tied with the University of Queensland and are a founding partner of the world-class Translational Research Institute, TRI, based here in Brisbane. This ensures our teams work in state-of-the-art facilities and can collaborate with other world-leading researchers. Our bench-to-bedside philosophy is driven by the passion and talent of our MARTA researchers. We are also committed to the values of our founders, the Sisters of Mercy, of honouring and promoting the dignity of human life and all creation, acting with compassion and integrity, and always striving for excellence.
We work with our community and research collaborators locally, nationally and internationally to remain at the cutting edge of scientific discovery. This is to keep inspiring each other and hopefully future generations of scientists.
Our more than 300 researchers work on a range of translational research studies, from laboratory studies, preclinical research, and initial clinical observations to proof of concept and cohort studies, human clinical trials, and controlled studies. We integrate these types of studies into practice through comparative effectiveness research, post-marketing studies, phase 4 trials, and clinical outcomes.
Our relationship with Mater Health makes us a research institute of choice to partner with for clinical trials. We are currently running over 190 clinical trials across our 5 research programs, with the majority of those being early phase.
Our Mater researchers have a strong track record of attracting NHMRC and MRFF funding, but are also significantly funded by the community through Mater Foundation. This unique relationship with Mater Foundation contributes millions of dollars each year for pilot trials and projects, and vital infrastructure and resources.
The funding also provides fellowships for our senior researchers, backfill for salaries for our clinicians to enable more clinician-led research projects. Financial backing ensures that we can see our projects through to the end, regardless of the short-term nature of our grant funding.
While supporting researchers at all stages of their career, Mater Research is also helping mould the scientific leaders of the future by offering university students the opportunity to undertake undergraduate and postgraduate projects in biomedical or medical research, nursing, midwifery, or allied health. Mater Research's success lies in our bright minds and using technology to advance scientific discoveries that push boundaries. And at the heart of it is our commitment to find answers that give people hope, improved health, and better lives.
Thank you. Disease at some time in our lifetime is something that we will all face, whether it is a disease of the mind or the body. It is also something that we will see in our loved ones. At Mater Research, through our programs, we tackle chronic and neurological diseases, as well as cancer. And we aim to improve health service research systems and smooth the journey during pregnancy and the transition to early life. End-of-life care is equally important. Sessions later in the morning will showcase some of these aspects. We will also talk about our history and heritage. Formally founded by Governor General William Dean in 1999, our research fosters collaborations between the Mater Ministries and our partners, the University of Queensland, the Translational Research Institute, and Health Translation Queensland. Through a combination of generous philanthropic support from Mater Foundation and external peer-reviewed government grants, these local networks have meant that Queensland has had global impact, with significant advances in perinatal health and obstetrics, in cancer, immunology, molecular biology, and genetics, to name a few. Through the Mater Clinical Trial Service, we also provide Mater patients with access to novel drugs, vaccines, and new ways of implementation in such diverse fields as cystic fibrosis, inflammation of the bowel, and women's cancers. The last 23 years have seen profound change in the way we communicate, the way we work, and even in the environment that we live in. Perhaps the greatest embodiment of that change was seen this year with the loss of Australia and the Commonwealth's head of state. In this world of constant change, Mater Research has been consistent to strive to focus on the unmet needs of the vulnerable, the Indigenous, and the culturally diverse in our community. We are gathered in a state-of-the-art auditorium in a building that provides access to cutting-edge technology. But make no mistake, the biggest asset of Mater Research is our people. That's what makes Mater Research so special. People like Dr. Cassie Franklin, a psychiatrist and clinician researcher who, together with her team, performed work on intellectual disability that recently led to the award of a $1.5 million NHMRC targeted call for research grant aimed at improving primary healthcare measures for the 450,000 Australians living with intellectual disability. Or people like Associate Professor Katharina Ronica and team member Dr. Stacey Bartlett, who identified a key cause of severe COVID-19 infections that may pave the way for an entirely new way of treating this disease by blocking cholesterol receptors on immune cells. And a special mention to Associate Professor Paul Dawson, whose recent career success is a testament to his optimism, his humility, dedication, and perseverance. By leveraging a Mater Foundation seeding grant, he generated pilot data investigating the link between sulfate deficiency and cerebral palsy that has more recently led to a substantial external peer-reviewed funding grant. However, I can't say more because that grant is currently under embargo. But thank you, Professor Kelso. I'd now like to introduce Songwoman Baringa for the Welcome to Country. Songwoman Baringa is the daughter of Turrbal elder Maruchi Baramba. As a Chevening and Roberta Sykes Scholar, Baringa completed an MBA at the University of Cambridge. She has worked in a diverse range of finance, strategy, and operation roles to deliver projects across Australia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. She is passionate about working with Indigenous communities to improve social, cultural, and economic outcomes. Songwoman Baringa.
Balimdiko gunda numbule, balimdigo gunda numbule, yanina yango gunda yango. Balimdigo gunda numbule, balimdigo gunda numbule. Bulkari Maramba Mianjanu. That's welcome to Brisbane in the language of the Turrbal people. My name is Baringa, which means the summit in Gubbi Gubbi language. And I'm a Turrbal and Gubbi Gubbi woman, meaning I've got bloodline connection here in Brisbane and also up on the Sunshine Coast. So I'm what we call a songwoman in training. So today I'm here on behalf of my mother, who is a fully fledged songwoman. I'm not sure if any of you may have seen her, Maruchi Baramba. So I'm in training, so I'm getting there, not quite at my mother's level, but I'm getting there slowly but surely. Now she usually delivers our welcome to countries, but she's taking some well-deserved time off. So you're stuck with me today, folks. Sorry about that. So the cloak that I'm wearing, I usually like to explain a little bit about it. So it actually belonged to my grandmother, and her totem was the owl, which is painted on the back. I'll show you. So we wear our cloaks for special occasions, such as what I'm doing here today, delivering a traditional welcome to country. Actually, a couple of months ago, I got married and I wore my full traditional dress, and my husband, he was gifted his cloak to officially welcome him into our tribe. So they're made out of kangaroo skin. I believe I've got 3 kangaroos here on me, so it's very, very warm, actually a little bit hot in this weather. Now I'm going to ask a question, but before I do, I'm keen to gauge from the audience, how many people are from Brisbane, live in Brisbane? Okay, so it's the majority. Have we got folks from interstate? Couple? Okay, so I'm expecting everyone to know the answer to this question. Are you ready? Yeah, that's where you go, yeah. Okay, what is the Turrbal word for Brisbane? Yes, I heard a whisper over here. Anyone on this side? Wow. Okay, I'm actually impressed. Oftentimes when we ask this question, the response is a deafening silence with maybe crickets chirping in the background or tumbleweed blowing across the room. And that's amazing. But you know what would be even better is if every single person, especially those living here, if everyone left today knowing that word. So I'm going to get you to repeat after me. Me. Oh, okay. Moo. I know we're mostly scientists, researchers. Let's get some energy. Come on, guys. Me.
Me.
An.
An.
Jen.
Jen.
Me Anton.
Mianjin.
Wow, practically fluent. That is our word, Mianjin, for Brisbane, and it means place of the blue water lilies. So we often like to share just a little bit about our language when we do our welcomes. It was funny, a couple of days ago, I had a colleague call me up and he said, look, I've just moved up to Mianjin. I was living down on Wurundjeri country down in Melbourne. And the language there really permeates the society. You see Wurundjeri language everywhere, whereas here it's absent. And I said, really? I think it might be one of those things that it's maybe people just don't notice it because our language is everywhere. So where we are today, Woolloongabba, that's the anglicized version. In our language, it's Woolloongabba, and it means place of the whirling waters. Just down the road, we've got Kurilpa, the Kurilpa Bridge near State Library. So that means place of the water rat. We've got Balimba, I guess in the Aussie accent, Balimba, which is over east, and that means place of the butterflies. We've got, in our language, it's Binkenba, which is Pinkenba, place of turtles. I live up in Kippering. Kippa means young boy in our language, as that's where young boys would go through their initiation. So we're actually the custodians of the Kippering of Kippering, which is a sacred ceremonial ground. And my boss, he didn't really like this one. He lives in Indro. And Indurupili in our language means place of the leeches. So it's like, what can I say? No, he's amazing. I adore my boss. So yeah, we often like to just share a little bit about it. You'll see it's literally everywhere. Tuwong, Tumbul, Nanda. Our language is everywhere. I think a lot of people just don't realize it. Now, before I deliver the blessing of the gathering, I want to thank Marta Research for inviting us to be here today. We are always so grateful that we get these opportunities to share a little bit of our story and our culture with the broader community. And I also want to wish you the very best for your conference, your showcase today. From what I've heard, got some amazing speakers, got some prize winners. Let's get a round of applause for the prize winners. It's amazing. And this is the complete opposite of my space. So I work in business and cultural affairs, kind of where the two merge together, looking at how we can drive economic change that leads to social impact in Aboriginal communities. But the science side of stuff, I'm just so fascinated by it, and I have so much respect for people working in this space. It's literally I know nothing about it. I leave it to smart folks like you. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing to drive positive and much needed change in the world. Now, before I deliver the blessing of the gathering, I'd like to share a little bit about our people. So I think, unfortunately, here in Brisbane, a lot of people don't know the history of the lands on which we're working and living prior to British colonisation. And so, as I said, we always take this time in our welcomes to share this with the community. So my family, we are direct descendants of a man named Dakiyaka, which means the healer in our language. Now, his name was anglicised to the Duke of York. I don't know if we've got any Bridgerton fans in here, but I find it very posh and bougie, the Duke of York. Now, he was documented as being the chief of the Brisbane tribe in the 1820s. Now, sorry, the 1830s. Now, historical records show that the Turrbal tribe was numbered in the thousands at the beginning of British colonisation here in Queensland in the 1820s. Now, fast forward just 40 years, and that number decreased to near extinction. So Tom Petrie of the founding family of modern day Brisbane stated in a select committee hearing that that number was just 5. So from thousands down to 5, a lot of people don't know that there was a genocide that took place here in Brisbane. Now, we survived thanks to the actions of my ancestor Kulkarwa. She was Dakiyaka's daughter. Her name, surprise, surprise, was also anglicised to Kitty. But Kulkarwa means black cockatoo, and my little sister's actually named after her. So she's one of our heroes, I would say, in that she fled. So when the genocide was taking place here, she fled and she went up to Gubbi Gubbi country. I mentioned I have bloodline connection up there. So she went up to the Sunshine Coast, to be with her mother's people. And if you read historical records, it will explain, you'll see that she spoke about the really bad things that took place in Brisbane and that she had to leave. And so what that meant was that there were no Turrbal people here in Brisbane to tell our story in the, let's say, 1890s, early 1900s. And so what happened was, with time, the Yagara people or Jagara from southwest started moving across. And so oftentimes when people talk about Brisbane, they talk about the traditional owners being the Turrbal and the Yagara people. We take this opportunity to explain that that's not correct, that is factually incorrect. It was the Turrbal people. It's just we were almost extinct and we didn't have our people here to tell our stories when historians came in around the early 1900s to start taking records. Oh, so who are the traditional owners here? So the Yagara people, yes, they have been here for about 100 years. Our people have been caring for country here for 60,000 years. So we have a good relationship with the elders. And, you know, they'll often, when people go to them for welcomes, they always refer, no, you need to go to Turrbal because we have something called primary bloodline connection. So I mentioned the bloodline connection. That's to do with your people have been here caring for country for 60,000 years. But in our culture, we also have things called secondary rights to speak for country, tertiary. And these are other groups that you acknowledge. They do have a connection to the country because they've been here practicing culture for hundreds of years, but it's not the same as the primary bloodline. And so I often like to explain a little bit about the welcome to country and give context. But before I do that, so not song woman, Kukarawa, she was a song woman. And that is something we, the modern day Turrbal people, have inherited as a cultural responsibility. And I'll explain what this means in a second for when we do our welcomes. But I like to give context around the welcome to country because I think, and I guess it's relevant for when people do acknowledgement of country as well. People, and I'm sure not here, but you know, there are some folks, oh, why do we have to do this PC nonsense acknowledgement? What is this? But for our people, it's a very, very important spiritual ceremony, the welcome to country. So we have a very deep connection to the land. And I know in Western society, you know, people look at the land as a commodity to be exploited. Whereas for our people, we look at what do we need to do to ensure that the land is healthy and well. And so it's a very different way of looking at things. And so in traditional times, even today, you've got different groups, clans, tribes, communities who have that inherited cultural responsibility to care for land and or water. And like I said, you inherit that through having that bloodline connection. And so in traditional times, you couldn't just wander on into an area where you didn't have that connection. Like, hey, mate, how's it going? People often think we're joking when we say this, but it could result in one being speared. It's considered very sacrilegious. So what needed to happen is that you would be welcomed in to the land spiritually. And so I often like to give this example, you know, after this session today, if you go home and you've got some stranger sitting in your living room, you're going to be like, whoa, who on earth are you? What are you doing in my house? So for our people, it was the same, but for much larger areas. So for us Turrbal people, it's for all of Brisbane. So in accordance with our laws and customs, when we welcome people to our country, we do it in song. And so the song that I'm going to sing, it's a sacred song. And what I'm doing is reaching out to a divine being, whether you call that God, universe, creator, it doesn't matter. It's about the sentiment behind it. And I'm reaching out to this being and asking it to bring as much positive energy as possible into the space. So for any spiritual folks here, I don't know if it's science and spirituality, if they mesh well, but maybe there are some here. It's about raising vibrations. So if you think of like your radio, it's about tuning into the station that's going to bring the most positive energy into this space. Then after that, I'll share a welcome song that comes from Cherbourg. It's a very well-known song here in Aboriginal communities, Southeast Queensland. So my mum and my grandma are from Cherbourg. I'm not sure if people know about Cherbourg here, but a lot of our people were taken there to the reserve in the 1890s as a part of the Aboriginals Protection Act. And so in living there, there's kind of an amalgamation of lots of different cultures from different groups. And so we've been quite fortunate that our culture has remained very strong. And so my grandma has passed our stories down to my mum, who's passed them down to me. So this song was written by my mum, who, as I mentioned, she is a song woman. And I'll be stepping into this role with my cousins and my siblings. So yeah, without further ado, I will now sing the blessing song. And I wish you all the very best for your showcase, and congratulations again to the prize winners. Thank you. Manda Barita Murianamen Manda Barita Murianamen Vitta Gari Yasai Gavai Gari Buja Manda Barita Murianamen Garini Nanami Jujamobironu Garini Nanami Jujamobironu Garini Nanami Jujamobironu. Woo! Thank you.
I think you all must agree that was absolutely incredible. And for those of you who live in Indooroopilly, I'm very sorry. Okay, so this just leads me to introduce our keynote speaker and special guest, Professor Anne Kelso, who is the CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, and who was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2007 for service to science. Following her PhD from the University of Melbourne, she undertook research in immunology at the Swiss Institute for Experimental Cancer Research, also the Walter and Eliza Hall, and here in Queensland at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research. She was also director and CEO of the CRC for Vaccine Technology from 2000 until 2006. She then returned to Melbourne as director of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza. And then in 2007, she continued that until 2015, when she took up her current role with the NHMRC. Professor Anne Kelso, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahir, and thank you to Songwoman Baringa for that truly extraordinary welcome to her country. I'm just delighted to be here today. It's always fun to come back to Brisbane, having lived here for quite a long time, and of course, always wonderful to be in this brilliant building and auditorium. Now, my talk today is really directed at the NHMRC grant applicants in the audience, and I know there are a lot of people here who are more broadly associated with MARTA research and not as applicants, so I hope there'll be something of interest for you as well. I was asked to talk about what's on our agenda this year, so I'm going to just quickly skim over several different things. First of all, a few comments about the grant program overall and where the money comes from, how much we have of it, some interesting trends, a little bit about peer review, which of course underpins the award of grants to applicants around the country. And then finally, a little bit about what we're doing to influence research culture. NHMRC as a funding source, many people want funds from NHMRC. We have the power to influence the culture of research in this country to some extent, and we want to use that well. So that's broadly what I'm going to cover this morning in this talk. So first of all, to fund health and medical research, NHMRC receives funds each year through the federal budget into an account called the Medical Research Endowment Account. And this shows the funds that have been coming in up until this year, which is the one with the red arrow. So over the last 20 years, you can see we've had actually a bit more than a threefold rise in the total budget that we have to expend on research. But it's also clear that it's been on kind of a plateau for a very long time. It goes up each year with quite a low rate of indexation. And so we're very aware that that means we can award fewer grants today than we could at one time. And so the pressures are very significant on this system. But we are nevertheless, I think, aware that we have another great big fund from the Commonwealth now, the Medical Research Future Fund, which puts another 650 million into the system every year on top of the roughly 850 to 900 million that NHMRC can disperse through its own funds. So it's, I think, also important to see that the government, successive governments have been committed to continuing to fund NHMRC, and so we continue to exist and be able to support research in wonderful places like this. Just very broadly, we distribute these grants across several different grant schemes, and the largest of those is the one shown in the panel on the left. You can see investigator grants. It's actually about 40, most years it's about 40% of our budget. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but this scheme offers a fellowship, which means a salary for researchers plus a research support package for people at different stages of their career, from early postdoc through to most senior researchers. Our next biggest scheme is the Ideas Grant Scheme, a really important scheme for research around the country, and then a number of others that I'll mention as we go along the way. Now, applicants will know that when you apply for a grant, you have the option to tick a box that broadly describes the type of research you do: basic, clinical, public health, and research to improve the delivery of health services. And you can see from this pie chart in the middle that a little bit, the largest amount of that budget goes to basic science. That means discovery science at the lab bench in most cases. And the next biggest is to clinical science in medicine, then public health, and then health services research. So that's how it falls out as a result of the design of our schemes and the peer review process, as well as, of course, the applications we receive. Most of that money goes directly to universities. Some of it goes to medical research institutes. Less than 1% goes directly to hospitals and other sorts of research institutions, but that's mostly because they're running their grants through a university. So we're really supporting research across every type of public research institution in the country. Now, there's always a lot of interest in numbers of applications, how many grants we give, and therefore what the success rate is for grants. And this slide contains some of those data. If you look at the first two rows, you can see investigator grants and ideas grants get the most applications by far. These are our really big schemes. They collectively add up to about 65% of the budget. And you can see that's where the real pressure is. Huge numbers of applications that are coming from the sector around the country. And then of the order of 250 of each of those are awarded each year. So it's a pretty small number out of all of those applications. So now we're looking at a funded rate for ideas grants. It's currently the most competitive scheme. Last year, that funded rate was 9.9%. It's really low. This year for investigator grants, we're up above 15%, which is heading in the right direction. But it's really because, as you can see from one of the columns, we've had a reduction in the number of applications, and I want to say a little bit more about that. But if you just look overall at that column that's funded rate, you can see that it's mostly pretty hard to get an NHMRC grant. And so when MARTA research people win an NHMRC grant, that absolutely should be celebrated. It's a sign of excellence, and we're really delighted that, that those grants are coming here. I mentioned that application numbers are declining for some of our schemes, and that's been really interesting to see over the last 3 to 4 years. So investigator grants, they've declined every year since the first year of the scheme, which was the 2019 application year. Ideas grants have dropped, particularly since 2020. We've seen a big drop in numbers of applications for clinical trials and cohort studies. and also some dropped for postgraduate scholarships, and others are more or less steady. Now, this is really interesting because, of course, this period has also coincided with the pandemic. So we've been really interested to try to understand what's going on here, because we've made a lot of changes before the 2019 round. People have been differentially affected around the country by the pandemic, and we don't yet fully know what the basis is of these declining numbers. To some extent, it could be because the system was designed to create some capping rules so that over time there will be more people funded for 5 years and therefore less wanting to come back every year into the system. So it's a good thing from the point of view of having a higher success rates for grants. But when we look at the data closely, a couple of things we've learned so far. There's no specific gender effect, which is really good. Probably most of the decline is in the mid-career stage. And so we don't fully understand what that's all about yet. And I'm very interested to hear from researchers and institutional leaders about what they think are the contributing factors. We can guess at them, but it's very important for us to understand. And has the potential, as we understand what's happening, then we can, of course, adjust our policies to try to address any issues. So just for a few comments there about what I've said so far, we have basically steady funding coming from the federal budget into the Medical Research Endowment account, rising with indexation, not exactly keeping up with the rise in the cost of doing research. This year, we've got about 920 million overall to distribute to new grants. So we're steady at around 900 million each year at the moment. And we've had this decrease in the number of applications for some of our major schemes, particularly since 2020. So we're going to watch those numbers very closely. We're interested to learn more about whether certain applicant cohorts are changing. And we're also concerned about the continuing effects of COVID-19 pandemic on people's ability to do their research, either for the flow-on effects of the long lockdowns and looking after kids at home and all of these complex issues that everybody's experienced over the last few years, as well as the interruption of actual research programs by the pandemic. So there's a lot to watch and a lot for us to try to respond to the extent that's possible. Now, I mentioned that peer review is really at the heart of the distribution of grants by NHMRC, and we've been making some important changes over the last few years, sometimes controversial, I expect, because this really matters, and we expect really anything that we do that affects peer review is bound to be controversial to some extent. So I just want to say a word about a couple of those things. So first of all, we're really looking at how we refine and streamline peer review, and it's a very challenging process because whatever we do, of course, affects how people feel about when they get a grant or when they don't. For our two largest schemes, investigator grants and ideas grants, we've made a very important change that I'll say a little bit more about in the next slide. And that's called application-centric peer review. It's a dreadful term, but it really means that we're looking for peer reviewers for each grant instead of each panel of grants. I'll say more about what I mean about that. Many people, when they receive the scores of their grant, they worry that maybe, they had 5 assessors, but maybe one of them was an outlier, and it was because of that one maybe negative review that they didn't get the grant. And of course, when you have a highly competitive system and every score counts from an assessor, peer review's work is absolutely critical and important here. Then if you're at the boundary, then yes, of course, one outlier score could determine whether you do or you don't get the grant. So I think this is something that we've worked on a lot, and it's important for applicants to know how much attention is being paid to this issue, even though it's a complex one. So our secretariat for each grant scheme looks at all of the scores for each of the investigator and ideas grant applications to look for any that are significantly different from the other ones for the same grant. And then they look at whether the scores align with the comments. And if they don't, or if there's something else that looks odd, then they will contact the peer reviewer to see whether an error has been made. And it's an effective process because we do find each year that a few reviewers have put the wrong scores in for that grant, and this process is picking that up. It's an important form of quality control that is getting better all the time. Something else we've done this year for the Ideas Grant Scheme is for each group of 5 peer reviewers of a grant, we're now, after they've finished their scoring and provided their comments, we are sharing those comments with the other reviewers of the same grant. And that's proving to be, I think, a very useful process for people to learn about how others have looked at the same proposal and to identify any issues. And we are continuing to focus on how we can improve support and training for peer reviewers, which is something I know many other people are interested in as well. So just to say a little bit more about this application-centric process, in earlier times, we would always have grant review panels, and we still do for almost all of our schemes, but we don't for the two big ones, investigator and ideas grants. And we had a lot of trouble with these very big schemes, lots of applications, extraordinarily diverse, everything from discovery research at the bench through to, let's say, a population health intervention in a remote community. Very, very diverse research. And so if you're looking to find a panel of people to review, let's say 100 applications, it's extremely difficult to get all the expertise you need on that panel to do a really good job. And so we've moved to finding the best 5 assessors for each application. So effectively, each application has its own panel, and very often that means it's a unique panel. Then each reviewer reviews the application independently, and we've found that this is much, much better for the matching of expertise and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. And of course, now that we're sharing comments between that group of 5 reviewers, there's an extra level of accountability and feedback. So just to show how that's improved the matching to expertise, on the left-hand side, you can see for this is based on what peer reviewers themselves have said would be a good match. They're asked to look at a whole lot of synopses of grant applications and say which ones they're suitable for. If you look at the bottom of that figure on the left, you can see that now in 2022, we've got almost 90% of reviewers for each application have said that they have the right expertise to review that grant. And that's a lot better than a few years ago. So our processes and the response of the sector is getting better and better. And then on the right-hand side, it shows what peer reviewers have told us after they've finished their work for the scheme. We've asked them the question in a survey of many different questions. We've asked them whether they agree that the applications assigned to them to review match their area of expertise. And there you can see that more than 90% have either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So the matching is working really well and just getting better each year. And so then we will continue to work on other aspects of that process. And then finally, to say a few words about research culture and incentives. As I said at the beginning, I think that NHMRC has the chance to influence the culture of research, and we're very concerned that our policies would support a focus on quality of research and impact of research on the community, on the health system, on the growth of knowledge of how health and disease are controlled. And so we think very carefully about all of our policies through that lens of how we have an influence beyond simply the grants that we award. So there have been 2 important changes this year. And one is, from a broad perspective, quite a micro change, but I think it might have a bigger influence. And that is for our 2 schemes, investigator grants and synergy grants, which are largely based on the track record of the applicants. We now, instead of asking people to tell us all of their publications for the last 10 years and ask assessors to consider the quality of all of those publications, for some people that can be a list of 300 or so, we're now asking people just to tell us about their best 10 and why they've chosen them, what their contribution to science is. There's a very deliberate intent here. Of course, it makes the workload less, but I think far more important than that is it shifts thinking about what we publish as researchers onto the quality and impact of that research, not simply the accumulation of large numbers of publications in a list. And it makes it much easier for peer reviewers to look at people's publication list, their top 10, and look carefully at those papers instead of just skimming a long list and saying, oh, there's so many in this journal and so many in that journal. So we really want to be part of what is in fact a global movement towards a greater focus on real outputs of research, real outcomes and impact of research, rather than what could be considered academic indicators. Now, publications are still incredibly important because They are peer reviewed. They're the place where you put the data, you make the argument, it's there for the world to see, and it's a critical first step in the pathway to impact. But it's not the only step, and this focus on the quality of that research rather than quantity, we think is an important thing that's happening in many places around the world now, and we're pleased to have introduced that for this year. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about gender equity, and many people will be aware that we recently, with our minister, announced a significant new gender equity initiative. NHMRC has been working on gender equity for a long, long time, certainly precedes my time joining NHMRC as CEO. And if we look over 10 years of receiving applications and giving grants, there's been real progress towards equity and parity. So the figures here show, as I've written below, that the ratio of male to female lead investigators on applications and on grants has decreased over time, so they're getting nearer and nearer to equal. The proportion of grants and funds awarded to men and women is getting nearer and nearer to parity. And something that's not shown on this slide is that the funded rate, the success rate for male and female lead investigators has been pretty much equal since 2017, when we introduced an initiative then, which is near miss funding for women. Something we haven't known about up till now, but we will in the future, is the number of or proportion of people in our sector who would identify as non-binary or some other term to describe their gender identity. And so from now on, we'll be asking applicants, if they wish, to provide that information, so we have more information about non-binary genders. So really good progress has been made, but that's an average of what's happened across all of our grant schemes. And there are some problems that I think that this good news story hides. And so in particular, I want to talk about the investigator grant scheme, because this is our fellowship scheme. I've already emphasized that that's our largest scheme, 40% of our budget. And this is a scheme where grants are awarded at different career stages, from early career, that's emerging leadership 1 on these figures, through to late stage career, almost senior people, L3, leadership level 3. So there's been a story for a long time here, and you can see it with the 4 figures shown on this slide, that at the earliest career stage, immediately post-PhD, there are more applications from women than from men. But by the time you get to the most senior levels of the scheme, there are far more applications from men than from women. And so you see this really dramatic falling away. It's true as percentages shown here. It's true as numbers, raw numbers, if you look at numbers of applications from women. So I think in thinking about this, this is not just a 4-year issue. We've been looking back, trying to drag out historical data which haven't been published, and we can certainly go back to 2000. And from 2001 on, that's 21 years now, we've had more applications from women than from men at the earliest career stage to our fellowship scheme. So this, and we've had a very steady picture of these so-called scissor graphs since that time. So this is not a 4-year problem, it's a 20+ year issue with very little movement in our data over that time. So that's why we've decided to do something important. The outcome for investigator grants has been that we've had about 35% more grants going to men than to women, and about 67% more funding going to men than to women. It really reflects that attrition that you see of women from the applicant pool with time. So the problem we're trying to solve with our intervention is the attrition of women as they progress through their careers, leading to these quite big differences in funding going to men versus women. So of course, there are a lot of complex issues that feed into this, and I'm not going to go over those issues now. We talked about them quite a lot when we went around the country in August talking about what we should do about this issue. So there isn't time to go over that now. But we do see this as not being about individual women's personal circumstances, whether they've had children, whether they've had illness, whether they have other caring responsibilities. We see from our data and from a great deal of analysis around the world that this reflects a systemic disadvantage that women experience in their careers, and therefore it's appropriate to have a systemic response to it. And as I've said, there's been very little progress. over 20 plus years of NHMRC fellowship. So it's a long wait if we're simply waiting for a pipeline effect to solve itself. We consulted through this year, starting with a release of data in February, a couple of webinars, then a discussion paper in July, online survey, roundtables with various groups, and then a tour of the country where we did 9 different forums talking about the data and having Q&A and collecting responses through an online Menti survey during the forums. So we attempted to consult quite widely about this issue and what we should do next. What we are now doing from next year on is something that I think is, it is quite bold, and it's certainly not popular with everybody, and we appreciate those issues. First of all, we will continue to use near-miss funding at the more junior levels of the scheme, where in fact there's very little problem to solve now. Men and women do very well. We have plenty of applications from women, and I think we don't need to intervene much at that level at all. But at the more senior levels, we're going to introduce the target of equal numbers of grants by gender at the combined leadership levels of 1 to 3, treating them as a single group. That is women and non-binary applicants on one hand and male applicants on the other hand. And then we'll be monitoring, of course, very closely how this plays out over the next few years. If it's not having the desired effect of improving the balance of the sector, then we'll simply stop it. And if it is having an effect, then we will continue it until we've achieved a good target. And there'll be reporting back to the sector about those outcomes. We were really delighted that both the Minister for Health and the Minister for Women announced this initiative on the 12th of October, shown here at the Shine Dome in Canberra. And that was a big day for us after a lot of engagement with the sector over years, but particularly this year. So I've spoken as quickly as I can on a very wide range of topics that I hope will be of interest to at least some people in the audience. A little bit about how we're monitoring funding outcomes and trends. Some of what we're doing with peer review, a hugely complex and controversial topic. And then the interventions we're making from now on to support an improvement in the focus on research quality instead of quantity of outputs, and this really very major intervention to improve gender equity in our largest scheme. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to talk with people in the breaks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think we all found that very thought-provoking, and I'd just like to formally thank you for everything that you're doing with your efforts for gender equity. So now we're moving to the main part of our program, where we'll briefly have some excerpts from our more junior researchers, and then moving on to our senior researchers, and then talking about the history of market research. And along the way, we will award various medals and prizes. We will have different chairs for the different sessions, and the first session is Dr. Mohammed Morizaman, who I'd like to invite to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Maher. Thanks everyone for coming here. So in this session, we will hear from the 2 awardees of our ECR Seeding Grants 2022, who were chosen through a competitive process of written project proposal and a persuasive presentation to a Matter Foundation judging panel at the Future Leaders Symposium held in September. The 2 awardees giving lightning talks today are Dr. Natasha Jansz from the biomedical category and Dr. Grace Branjerdporn from the clinical category. So our first speaker would be Dr. Natasha. So Natasha joined Matter Research in 2021 to study retroviruses, the virus that are integrated into the human genome. Natasha has a background of molecular epigenetics, having trained at WIHI under Professor Marin Bluick. She was awarded Human Frontiers and EMBO postdoctoral fellowships to train at the Helmholtz Institutes of Epigenetics and Stem Cells in Munich. In 2021, Natasha had joined Professor Geoffrey Faulkner supported by an NHMRC investigator grant to investigate the epigenetic mechanisms governing retrovirus regulation in infectious and malignant diseases, with a focus on HTLV1C, which is endemic to Central Australia. So Natasha's research project focuses on genetic and epigenetic variation of HTLV1C in patients and humanized mouse models of HTLV1C associated diseases. So Natasha.
Cool. Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I also want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Turrbal people, and thank you to Songwoman Baringa for welcoming us to her country and teaching us a lot. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the First Nations people on this continent and around the world for their knowledge and contributions to this specific area of research that I work in. So I work on HTLV1, which is an ancient retrovirus. It's been infecting humans for thousands of years. But only a few years ago, it was found that Central Australia has the highest rate of HTLV1 in the world. So an unbiased screening of Aboriginal patients coming through Mbandwa or Alice Springs Hospital, it was found that almost 34% of Aboriginal patients were carriers for this virus. Raising an alarm and a need for research and attention and public health measures on to HTLV1. So HTLV1 stands for human T-cell lymphotrophic virus type 1. It affects an estimate of up to 20 million people worldwide, mainly in the global south and predominantly indigenous populations. It's a chronic virus causing lifelong infection, and it's associated with many diseases in different organs throughout the body. So as its name suggests, it underlies the development of an aggressive T-cell leukemia called ATLL. It can cause degeneration of the and inflammation of the nervous system, leaving patients wheelchair bound, and inflammation of a number of different organs, but I'm focusing on the lung, which manifests in bronchiectasis, as this is the most commonly presented associated disease here in Australia. And one big thing to note is that there's no cure or targeted treatments for HTLV1. So patients get this virus, they have it for life, and there's very little that we can do by way of treatment. So this is where our research comes in. So I have a background in studying the genome and genome regulation, and we want to know if studying the HTLV1 genome can illuminate novel therapeutic pathways. So HTLV1 is a type of virus that puts its DNA and its genome into the host cell, and it gets integrated into the targeted cell, like the target cell's genome. So we're going to use the latest sequencing platforms, so the Oxford Nanopore Technologies platforms, to really try and understand what's happening at this genetic level to see if we can reveal novel pathways for targeting in the future. So I want to thank the Mater Foundation and the NHMRC for supporting this research in what is a very important area that we need to learn more about. So thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Grace, who is a clinician lead for mental health, alcohol, and other drugs, focusing on the setup of Catherine's House for mothers, babies, and families. Grace is an occupational therapist and has had clinical experience working with pediatrics, rehabilitation.
I'd like to thank Mater
and mental health. So she completed her PhD in 2021 with Mater and UQ, focusing on women and without pregnancy loss. She has a recipient of a Betty McGrath seeding grant in 2021 to develop a mindfulness intervention to women in the prepartum. She has published over 26 peer-reviewed publications and was an invited speaker at TEDx UQ. So her research focuses on the evaluating Catherine's House, Australia's first integrated perinatal and infant mental health services. So Grace is not here today. She's overseas at the moment, and she kindly provided us a recording of her lightning talk.
I'd like to thank Mater Foundation for the Early Career Researcher Grant, which goes towards my project, which looks at the impact that Catherine's House has on mothers, family members and infants, particularly looking at the short and long-term outcomes. I'd like to thank Mater. From research, we know that the period before and after birth, called the perinatal period, is a high-risk time for the relapse of a pre-existing mental health problem or for the first onset of a mental health condition. Sadly, in Queensland and across Australia, suicide is the leading cause of death for women in the perinatal period. In particular, 1 in 5 have depression and anxiety, and there are a range of serious mental illnesses such as eating disorders, bipolar affective disorder, as well as schizophrenia that women may experience. Care for women such as these is often fragmented and hard to navigate, leaving women falling between the cracks. Secondly, women are more than likely to be admitted to a general psychiatric unit, which means that women are separated from their babies, which has adverse consequences for both the mother and the baby's relationship. So here at the Mater Hospital, we are introducing a new model of care, and to do that, we are currently refurbishing the convent to make it the new Catherine's House for mothers, babies and families. Here at Catherine's House, there will be a state-of-the-art inpatient mother and baby facility with 8 public beds and 2 private beds. Women will then be able to transition home and then receive ongoing outpatient care through day programs, psychology services, psychiatry, mental health nursing, general practitioner support, as well as volunteers in the home. You would think that this type of model of service is standard, but actually this is revolutionary. And so our research aims to assess the effectiveness of this model of care by tracking families over time, from the start of admission to the end of admission, 6 weeks, 6 months and 12 months later. We are looking at a range of outcomes such as quality of life, mother-baby bonding, mother-baby interaction and health economics. In doing so, we will be generating high-quality evidence-based practice to ensure that we have all families who receive the best start for all during the early years of life, and supports this service which provides a spectrum of care promoting wellness, healthy relationships and child development to ultimately ensure that our families are thriving families.
So thanks, Natasha and Grace. So now I'm handovering the session to Professor Alison Pettit to announce the Mater Research HDR and ECR prizes.
Thank you, Mohammed. The Early Career Researcher Prize, the Higher Degree Research Biomedical Student Prize, and the Dr. Lawrence Catley Clinical Student Prize are awarded to promising early career researchers and students in both a biomedical and a clinical category. These prizes are sponsored by the Mater Foundation, just as the clinical seeding grants that we just saw awarded. These individuals have made exceptional contributions to discovery, translation, and/or integration of new research knowledge into improved healthcare and education practices across Mater and the broader community. Through a rigorous application process, all nominations were assessed and ranked by a diverse review panel against the selection criteria applicable to the specific research prize. It's my pleasure to ask Professor Anne Kelso to come up and join me on the stage to hand over these prizes. Maybe we'll do it this side, Anne. Hannah will bring it over for you. So the nominees for the ECR Prize, the Early Career Researcher Prize, are Dr. Christine Andrews, Dr. Kavita Bish, Dr. Natasha Jansz, and Dr. Stacey Bartlett. And this year's winner is Christine Andrews. Congratulations, Christine. Please come up and accept your prize. So Christine is a leading implementation scientist in the Centre of Research, Centre of Research Excellence in Stillbirth. Her research focuses on implementation and evaluation of the stillbirth prevention strategies, including the National Safer Baby Bundle e-learning program that has been completed by over 10,000 clinicians. She has 11 MARTA research publications and has contributed to gaining over $8 million in research funding for the Mother and Baby program and has co-supervised 4 PhD students. Christine is also an emerging leader for enhancing consumer involvement in research, is a co-chair of the MARTA Research EMCR Committee, and is a representative on the MARTA Student Research Committee. So we congratulate Christine and thank her for all of her contributions to MARTA research. So the nominees for the HDR Biomedical Student Prize are Shen Zhang Fu, Jennifer Stables, Caden Kwa, Mohammed Sabdia, Madeline Go, Rabina Guri, Selwyn Samuel, and Svetlana Shutanova. So hopefully I got all of those out somewhere close to where they need to be. This year's winner is Jennifer Stables. Congratulations, Jen, and please come up and accept your award. I see Kate Irvine stepping up, so Jen must be away and will accept the award on her behalf. Jennifer's PhD research is delineating the molecular basis of a type of early onset dementia caused by mutations in the CSF1 receptor gene. She has already published a first author paper reporting characterization of a novel murine model of this condition and continues to undertake research to further dissect the underlying pathogenesis. She's received numerous awards throughout her candidature and is an outstanding communicator, being the MARTA Research 3MT winner and People's Choice Award. Jen is a student representative at the University of Queensland Faculty of Medicine Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, where she campaigns to help remove barriers for future students and is a young science ambassador for Queensland's Wonder of Science program. So we congratulate Jen. The nominees for the Dr. Lawrence Catley Clinical Student Prize are, Alicia Martin, Jade Kubler, and Lisa Gillender. And this year's winner is Alicia Martin. Congratulations, Alicia. You can please come up and accept your award, your prize. Since 2020, Alicia has led the acute stroke unit of the MARTA Hospital Brisbane in developing and adapting a transdisciplinary initial neurological screening assessment. This innovative screening assessment is now being translated into training resources, including e-learning modules on the MARTA Online LEAP platform. Alicia has published 3 first author papers and attracted more than $260,000 in funding to support her research within MARTA. Alicia also volunteers with the Centre for Community-Driven Research and is a clinical advisor council member for the Brisbane South Primary PHN network, where she helps direct investment and resources to priority populations, health and diseases. Congratulations. Thanks to Professor Kelso for bestowing these prizes, and congratulations again to all of the fantastic nominees and also the winners. And thanks again to MARTA Foundation for supporting these prizes. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Kim Summers as the Session 3 Chair. Professor Kim Summers leads the Genetics, Genomics and Transcriptomics of Disease Research Group at MARTA Research. She has a long-standing interest in applying modern techniques of genetic analysis to improved understanding of complex human genetic conditions, including Marfan syndrome and more recently Gorlin syndrome. She collaborates with a number of other research groups at Marta Research to perform network analysis and identify clusters of co-expressed genes through to see whether they have similar function and regulation in disease. So that's a fantastic resource across Marta Research. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Ali, and congratulations to all our winners. So we're now going to hear from some of our senior researchers who all lead research groups at Marta. And these are people we often hear about in internal Marta communications, not just because of their stellar success at obtaining grant funding and publications, but also because their research is making a real difference to the lives of patients, which is in the end what we hear about. So our first senior researcher today is Professor Josephine Forbes, who you saw on the video earlier. So Jo leads the biomedical side of our chronic and integrated care program. She's an NH and MRC Leadership Fellow and UQ Professor of Medicine. Her research focuses on prevention of diabetes and its complications, aiming to build a greater understanding of the biological basis of diabetes. And as an indication of the importance of her work, she's part of an Australia-wide centre which aims to improve the prevention, management and treatment of diabetes and cardiovascular disease in Australia. And in the end, she and her group want to develop preventative strategies and novel treatments to improve patient outcomes with diabetes. So Jo is now going to talk to us about the wins and challenges in searching for potential new treatments for diabetes. Thank you.
It's always quite daunting when you make that transition to becoming a senior researcher. And so I wanted to talk to you about today about some of the challenges that we face in diabetes, but I also wanted to show you some of the wins that we've actually had in this space as well. So I actually wanted to start with COVID, which, most of you will think, why am I starting with COVID? But actually, I'm sure you've all seen this map. It's a worldwide map of the cases of COVID. And you can see here that there's about 632 million people who've been affected by COVID. And there's been about 6.7 million deaths. But probably what you don't know is that this map looks very similar when you superimpose diabetes over the top. And in fact, there's around 537 million people globally who have been diagnosed with diabetes. And the death rate in diabetes is about 6.7 million deaths every single year. And so as you can imagine, this is challenge number one, the absolute sheer numbers of people who are affected globally by diabetes. And you can see that in Australia over here, we're probably no different. We're about the same as the rest of the world, and it costs the Australian healthcare budget around $15 billion each year. So just very generally, diabetes is characterised by high levels of blood sugar. And the reason for this is because we have these particular islands in our pancreas, which make a sugar storage hormone called insulin. And so this hormone can either be absent in type 1 diabetes, or it can actually be not working appropriately, which is what happens primarily in type 2 diabetes and in also the gestational form of diabetes. It's one of the oldest recorded diseases, which is quite paradoxical because we think of diabetes as a modern day epidemic, but actually it's been around for a very long time. And as I said before, it affects around 4% of the world's population, and it's growing. I wanted to talk a little bit more, though, about type 1 diabetes. And so this is the form of diabetes which commonly arises in childhood and adolescence, but there are equally numbers of adults who are affected by type 1 diabetes. It makes up around about 10% of the cases of diabetes, but around about 30 to 40% of the cost. And the reason that this is important is because it happens in early life. And so these people require very intensive management for their whole life and are much more likely to develop the complications of diabetes, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. In type 1 diabetes, the immune system, which is our immune cell army, which fights against things like COVID, actually turns on itself and destroys these particular cells which make that hormone insulin. And these patients cannot survive without lifelong reconstitution of insulin, often through injections or pumps. And there's actually no cure. And there are a growing number of adults, and you see ex-British Prime Minister here, and there's been quite a few since her, Theresa May, was also someone who was accidentally diagnosed originally as having type 2 diabetes, but actually has type 1 diabetes. And so there's a growing number of adults. In diabetes, I'm particularly interested in kidney disease. And the reason for that is because kidney disease is the major risk factor for death and mortality in patients with diabetes. And the reason for this is because it's a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And that's what most patients with diabetes will succumb to over time. But kidney disease doesn't happen in isolation. It's almost always associated with other complications. And these provide a huge burden on the lives of people with diabetes and affects somewhere between 30 and 40% of patients. So what does diabetes look like for MARTA? Well, we know that around 14% of our inpatients do in fact have diabetes, and about 1,500 patients are treated in the outpatients clinics at the Queensland Diabetes and Endocrine Centre. Equally, at the MARTA Mothers Hospital, around 16% of our women who are coming in to have a baby are affected by diabetes. And so that's another growing number of women who are affected. But we also have a very specialised centre in the MARTA Young Adult Centre, which is responsible for the care of young people, 15 to 25-year-olds who have diabetes. And then we've treated around about 780 unique individuals in the last 5 years. So as you can see, diabetes is a significant burden on not just Australia, but also on healthcare systems, including those patients that we see at MARTA. We also know, though, that MARTA Group actually has a long-standing interest in diabetes and has been included in many, many different national and international studies looking at various treatments for diabetes and its complications. And so many of these, some of you may be familiar with. But what I want to tell you about today is one of the other challenges we're facing in diabetes, in that many of the people who are dying from diabetes each year are actually under the age of 50. And many of these do, in fact, have type 1 diabetes, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So because most of these patients who are dying are, in fact, dying, some of them are because they're not accessing proper healthcare. So that's in some non-Westernized nations. But many people are dying because of kidney and cardiovascular disease. And many, as I said, are under the age of 50. So our challenge number 2 is to try and understand why most of the clinical trials, which are being done by very large pharmaceutical companies, are targeting people over the age of 60. So that's a challenge in diabetes that we need to have more conversations about in terms of equity of care and accessibility of care for these people who are dying young. So another challenge is, okay, so if we want to look for these patients who are younger, who are developing diabetes earlier, and in fact getting the complications of diabetes, is can we actually find out who they are and who is at the highest risk so we can give them the best care? And certainly there are a number of studies that we are involved with, both all the way from birth, such as India, all the way up to the MARTA Young Adult Centre, in which we're actually looking for risk factors for these patients. And this is our pipeline for type 1 diabetes, but I'll also show you some data in a moment for patients with type 2 diabetes, because as you know, many of the patients affected by diabetes, in fact, the majority have type 2 diabetes. This is receding down our age groups. In fact, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, they have a 20-fold risk now in their children of developing type 2 diabetes. And so we're involved in this Pandora cohort, and we're looking at some of these vulnerable populations to see if not only are they developing type 2 diabetes, but are they developing diabetes-related kidney and cardiovascular disease early in life, which may in fact contribute to an early death. But we also know that many other populations, such as those, this is a study in America, but equally the statistics are the same in Australia. Youth with type 2 diabetes are also developing kidney disease. In fact, about 50% of youth who develop type 2 diabetes actually get kidney disease within a few years. So it's around about 13 years after they develop diabetes. So it's very early in life. And this is going to become much more evident over the next 20 years as these patients come through our healthcare system. But like every one of our chronic diseases, there are some even bigger challenges to be faced in diabetes. There's declining research funding, and that's not because groups like NHMRC are not putting forward better funding. It's actually because there are other economic things that are happening in the world, such as COVID and other things, which actually are competing for the money. So we need to think about how to more efficiently and effectively spend the money that we have. There's also a disease stigma in diabetes. You know, you deserve it, you didn't look after yourself. So, you know, we have that to deal with. And that also contributes to significant mental health problems in our patients with diabetes. We also know that we're having significant issues with the availability of some of the very new therapies, which we think are the best thing that we can do for patients with diabetes. We can't actually get the medications in Australia. So there's blockbuster therapies, they're reducing kidney and cardiovascular disease by about 20%, but we actually now, right at this moment, can't get them into the country and to our patients. So the patients are putting back on their weight and they're actually not actually getting treated. Or they're getting treated with some of the older therapies that we have available and the best available care. But at Mater, we're very proud because we're part of many of the things in terms of advocating for and designing solutions to address some of these things. So as part of my role, I'm the incoming president of the Australian Diabetes Society. And one of the things that I'm doing is actually bringing together all of these stakeholders. So these are just some of the stakeholders who are involved in the care of people with diabetes and some of the voices from the people living with diabetes. And what we're trying to do is put together a better plan of how to actually spend our research dollars so that we can get better healthcare outcomes. And so that's something that Mater is quite intimately involved with as well. And so I wanted to thank Mater Foundation, who have been very generous supporters of our research, all of these other entities, and my absolutely fantastic and outstanding team. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. So our next speaker is Associate Professor Jake Gratten. Jake's research applies advanced statistical methods to large-scale genetic data. He's aiming to improve the understanding of causes, mechanisms, and prediction of conditions affecting the brain and the nervous system, and particularly autism and Parkinson's disease. His group performs what we call discovery research, which means he's generating data that will allow us to build new hypotheses about these conditions. And this discovery research is the engine that drives Mater Research's bench-to-bedside translational pipeline. And Jake is going to tell us today about how he's using big genomic data to understand autism. Thank you, Jake.
Well, thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone. So in my lab, we use big genomic data to try to improve understanding of common brain conditions. And we have a particular interest in autism, which is an early onset condition that's diagnosed in about 1 in 100 Australian children. It's more common in boys than girls, and it now accounts for over 30% of primary indications in the NDIS. Diagnosis is based on assessments of 2 core signs: restricted and repetitive behaviors and difficulties with social communication. Whether or not you show these signs and receive a diagnosis is about 80% explained by differences in our DNA. But the picture is complex. It's not a case of 1 or a few autism genes, there are hundreds. On top of this genetic complexity, or perhaps as a consequence of it, the condition is clinically highly heterogeneous and almost always presents with other co-occurring conditions, including brain-related issues like intellectual disability, seizures, ADHD, anxiety, and sleep problems, and also systemic issues like GI complaints, immune dysfunction, and dietary restriction. In surveys of autistic people, it is these co-occurring conditions that rank most highly in relation to the impact on their quality of life, and yet they're the least studied. Today, I'd like to share with you how we're using large-scale genomic data in an Australian cohort to tease apart this heterogeneity to provide the evidence base for more effective interventions in autism. The Australian Autism Biobank is an initiative of the Autism CRC to establish a national resource for studying the biological basis of autism. I've been very fortunate to have an opportunity to contribute to this effort, which was directly supported by MARTA as an essential partner. It's involved an extraordinary network of people around the country, many shown here and some of whom you will recognise. One person in particular that I'd like to highlight this morning is Chloe Yap, an exceptional MD PhD student in my group. Chloe has been involved in this project from the very beginning, and because I'm going to be sharing results from her PhD today, Chloe deserves most of the credit. So ultimately, nearly 2,500 people agreed to take part in the biobank, including over 500 families, nearly 900 autistic children, and over 200 non-autistic siblings and controls. Detailed clinical and lifestyle data was collected on participants, along with over 4,000 biospecimens, including blood, stool, urine, and hair, from which we generated a number of genome-scale data sets, including on genetic markers, epigenetic markers, blood lipids, and the gut microbiome. We talk about big genomic data because these data sets are huge. For example, the genetic data set includes over 700,000 genetic markers per person in almost every participant. This amazing resource has enabled us, nearly 6 years after we first conceived the study design, to perform some of the largest and most carefully controlled genomic studies of autism to date, including on the gut microbiome and plasma lipids, which I'd like to share with you now. So I'm sure all of you are aware that we are home to a multitude of bacteria and that the community in our gut is the most diverse. The idea that the gut microbiome, which we know is essential for development of the immune system and which can lead to bowel disease when disrupted, might also contribute to mental health and behavior, has exploded in the past 10 years. In autism, the high rate of GI conditions has been the motivation for microbiome research. Early supporting evidence from animal models has led to human studies, and some of these have reported microbiome associations in autism. The resulting hype has seen rapid progression to clinical trials and commercial startup companies marketing microbiome-based interventions to the autistic population. Despite this excitement, the evidence is actually quite weak, and that's because published studies have been small, they've been difficult to reproduce, and many haven't adequately accounted for confounding factors like diet and age. Resolving the autism gut microbiome relationship was the reason why we included stool in the biospecimen protocols for the biobank. Our autism microbiome study is the largest to date, including nearly 100 autistic children and 148 non-autistic siblings and controls, all with deep linked data. We partnered with Microba here in Brisbane to sequence the genomes of all the bacteria in the stool samples to get a high-resolution snapshot of the microbiome. We carefully accounted for confounding factors like age and medications. What we found didn't match the scientific literature. We found very little evidence for direct association of autism with the microbiome overall. There was no difference in microbiome diversity in autism, and only one of over 600 bacterial species was differentially abundant. What we did find was a strong association of microbiome with diet. And that made us wonder if restricted and repetitive behaviors in autism might manifest as restricted dietary preferences. Sure enough, we found that autistic children had reduced dietary diversity, and this was most pronounced in children with more severe restricted and repetitive behaviors. Lower dietary diversity was associated with lower microbiome diversity, and this in turn was associated with GI symptoms like diarrhea. Crucially, we were able to show that genetic variations associated with autism could predict lower dietary diversity. What this means is that when it comes to the autism microbiome relationship, it's more a case of mind over microbes than the other way around. Because this was perhaps controversial, we convinced editors at Cell to publish this work. And the take-home messages were that microbiome-based interventions for autism are unlikely to be effective for the core diagnostic signs. And what we really need to do is better support families at mealtimes to provide autistic children with a healthy, balanced diet. Moving on, and more recently, we've been using plasma lipidomics to dissect the complex relationships between autism, neurodevelopment, genetics, and the environment. The rationale here is that lipids actually make up 60% of the human brain, and disrupted lipid metabolism has been reported in a subset of autistic people. We partnered with the Baker Institute in Melbourne to generate what is the largest lipidomics dataset in a pediatric cohort, comprising over 800 different plasma lipids in 765 children. What we found is that long-chain polyunsaturated acids are reduced in autism, and particularly with intellectual disability and sleep problems. By using linked genetic information, we could show that lower levels of specific long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids are causally related to sleep problems, and that these sleep-related lipids converge on those that are associated with an unhealthy diet. The take-home message here is that it's crucially important that we develop and implement interventions for sleep problems in autism to prevent chronic health problems in that population. Well, I hope that's given you a snapshot of how we're using big genomic data to address questions that are high priority for the autism and autistic communities. And thanks you all for listening. And I'd like to thank all the people who have been involved in this research, particularly Chloe, all of my autism CRC colleagues here at MARTA Research, the University of Queensland, and around the country. Heartfelt thank you to all the families who generously participated in the biobank, and also a sincere thank you to MARTA Foundation, MARTA Research, the NHMRC, and Autism CRC for supporting this research. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. So I'm now going to introduce Professor Janet Hardy. She's the clinical lead of our cancer program and Director of Palliative and Supportive Care across MARTA. She also holds an honorary professor position at the University of Queensland. Janet's research looks at cancer pain management. She's particularly interested in the use and abuse of steroids in cancer care and in medicinal cannabis. She's also involved in developing and testing new agents to suppress cancer pain. And since she joined MARTA, she's been able to combine her research interests with providing clinical care, and has been involved in many clinical trials, which are in fact a cornerstone of MARTA Research's bench to bedside approach. And Janet is going to talk to us today about medicinal cannabis for symptom management in patients with advanced cancer. Thank you, Janet.
Just here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Medicinal cannabis has been this enormous social phenomena that has come onto the scene over the last few years. And that's on the back of multiple anecdotal reports of benefit in a wide range of areas, including, if you look up Google, there are multiple magical things that it can achieve, including a cure for cancer and certainly in symptom management. This anecdotal evidence, on the back of very robust public pressure, led to the legalization of medicinal cannabis for the medical management of a number of indications, as mentioned here, including my field of palliation. This was with no systematic requirement for monitoring of efficacy or adverse effects. This in turn has led to an exponential growth of prescriptions for medicinal cannabis, mainly for pain and anxiety, and in turn has led to a multi-billion-dollar business with multiple cannabis companies springing up overnight to feed this market. On the back of this, a number of cannabis products have been approved. There's quite a stringent requirement to have your product approved, but there are now a number of oils and pastes and capsules available for the use in medicinal cannabis. This has all been very backwards forwards, however. Usually when you have a new product that's come onto the market, it's already been through a number of preclinical and animal tests, as well as early phase trials of humans to determine things like dosing and regimens and best indication. As far as medicinal cannabis is concerned, however, it's backwards. It's come on the market, and our job has been to try and answer some of the very many unknowns that are out there about it. It's not known what the best product or combination is, what the best route is. As you can see here, very little known about drug interactions, best symptoms to target, etc. Just a little bit of background, the cannabis plant is a very complex plant which contains a large number of different compounds. The two most prominent cannabinoids, however, are the THC, which is the component that makes you high and is meant to have these other beneficial effects as written there. And the other major component is cannabidiol, or CBD, which is meant to have anti-inflammatory, anti-epileptic, etc., as written here. The one complicating factor in all this is that THC, because it's psychoactive, it impairs one's ability to drive, and therefore it is illegal to drive when taking THC, whether for recreational or for medicinal use, and this obviously impacts on research that can be done. Very briefly, what is the evidence to date? Well, there is an established role now of CBD in some rare forms of childhood epilepsy. There is old data showing an anti-nausea effect of combination cannabis products. However, the trials done are all very old, and there is no published trial yet against the newer antiemetics, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that nausea is a side effect of many of the cannabis products. Pain is very complex. There are multiple reviews, and in fact, there are now reviews of reviews looking at cannabis and pain. Unfortunately, most of them are poor quality and haven't really been able to show a proper place for cannabis or where the role might be for cannabis for pain going forward. There's, when we first started research, there was really nothing as far as the other symptoms we commonly see in looking after patients with advanced cancer. And certainly nothing to date in quality of life, which is our bread and butter. So we were very fortunate to be recipients of one of the first future funds that was released to try and find some evidence to find a place for medicinal cannabis in the symptom control of patients with advanced cancer. And after a long period of very complex negotiation with multiple cannabis companies, including one in Jamaica, most of whom disappeared when there was first any talk of litigation or insurance or contracts, etc., we have been able to establish and run 2 quality randomized controlled trials, one looking at pure CBD versus placebo, the other looking at a combination of THC and CBD. All our trials are based on total symptom distress score, rather than trying to find a benefit in individual symptoms, which is shown to be so difficult. We're looking at a total cumulative distress score in cancer patients. Our first trial has been completed, the CBD versus placebo. And unfortunately, it was overwhelmingly negative. Briefly below the line in the waterfall plot is the percent response in the CBD group, which is about 44%. And in the placebo group, it was 53%. There was a non-significant difference here, but unfortunately in all our multiple outcome measures, we were unable to show that CBD was able to contribute any more to standard palliative care that we offer all patients. Pleasingly, this paper has been accepted in a top-tier journal, even though it's a negative study, and we're hoping it will influence policy going forward. Our second trial is one involving a combination of CBD and THC. We haven't been able to show that CBD contributes to symptom management, so hopefully it's the THC that has some effect here. And we've almost finished. We're hoping to finish this trial by the end of the year. And we've also been extremely fortunate to get a second Future Fund grant, which is going to allow us to dig deeper into some of the factors that have shown itself as possibly promising in our earlier trials. We want to look more at sleep. We want to look more at anxiety and depression, the whole issue around driving and inflammation. And this nebulous concept of happiness that so many of our patients cannot put their finger on why they feel better on cannabis, that claim to feel better, but can't say why. So with our colleagues at UQ, we're developing some qualitative studies to try and investigate more what this nebulous score is, and are we measuring the wrong thing, and should we be looking at an overall happiness scale? So that's where we are. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, especially my colleagues here at TRI, who have collaborated with us in a number of sub-studies that we've done along the way. So thank you very much. Thanks, Janet. So our final senior researcher today is Professor Sailesh Kumar, another of our clinician researchers. He's main professor of obstetrics and gynecology at UQ and senior specialist in maternal and fetal medicine and obstetrics at Mater Mothers Hospital. Sailesh is internationally recognized for his wide contribution to fetal health and medicine. His research focuses on fetal treatment and imaging and the development of techniques for prevention of bad pregnancy outcomes related to failure of that most important organ, the placenta. He holds an NH&MRC investigative fellowship and leads a multi-center clinical trial evaluating a novel treatment to prevent fetal problems at the time of birth. Sailesh will now give us an overview of the scope of the Genesis Maternal Fetal Medicine Research Group at Mater Research, including clinical trials, cohort studies, placental biomarkers, machine learning using large data sets, and more. How Sailesh finds time to do all that on top of his heavy clinical load, I don't know, but hopefully he's going to tell us about that now.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. As Kim has said, I'm a clinician. I look after women with complex medical and fetal problems in pregnancy. And really the area of my research focus is placenta-mediated complications. Many of you will realize the placenta is a central organ in pregnancy, and dysfunction within the placenta can cause a myriad of complications, both maternal as well as fetal. From a fetal perspective, at its extreme end, severe placental dysfunction can result in either a stillbirth or a death of a baby after birth. But what I think the majority of the population probably don't realize is that varying degrees of placental dysfunction can also result in equally serious complications, such as brain injury in the infant, suboptimal fetal growth, significant neonatal morbidity after birth, and so on. And in fact, if you look from a global perspective, disability-adjusted life years due to birth asphyxia, it's actually the burden of disease is comparable to congenital malformations, diabetes, and AIDS, HIV. And from an international perspective, 1 in 4 of all neonatal deaths and up to 1 in 2 of stillbirths are due to complications related to either problems in labor, usually secondary to placental dysfunction. I want to really, before I go on, really acknowledge members of my group who have really helped develop this area of research. And I really want to recognize current and previous PhD students, of which there are several, our fantastic team of research midwives who are key to running the clinical trials within the MARTA, and also our biostatistical and epidemiology experts, Kylie Crawford, previously Chris Flatley, and Veronica Schreiber, who've really driven the analytical part of our research. Our 5-year research vision really centers around 3 pillars. 1, clinical trials. 2, big data and epidemiology research. And 3, biomarker and prenatal ultrasound variables that we generate when we see women with complex fetal problems. We're currently running 2 large randomized control trials, iSearch and RIDSTRESS, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. And iSearch will really be part of a large international individual patient data prospective meta-analysis that we're running with the NHMRC Clinical Trial Center in Sydney. And we're also part of several other international and national clinical trials. We're partnering with an industry partner to develop our artificial intelligence and machine learning analytical ability, and Kylie is going to be leading on that. And the aim of this collaboration is to develop good screening tests to identify women at risk of placental-specific disorders, so complications such as small for gestational age or fetal growth restriction, hypoxia-related complications such as stillbirth, and so on. And our biomarker work is really to try and identify novel placentally derived biomarkers that are predictive of placental dysfunction and some of these clinical complications that I've just mentioned. And again, we're working with colleagues such as Sandra Richardson and Adam Ewing and Catherine Irvin here at the TRI and other national collaborators as well. And the overarching aim is to develop a good screening test that reliably identifies women at risk or infants at risk sufficiently early in pregnancy so that we can do something about mitigating these complications. As Kim said, we've been very fortunate to receive funding by an NHMRC investigator grant. And a couple of years ago, we were also fortunate to be funded by the Medical Research Future Fund to the tune of about 3.4 million to run this large randomized controlled trial. More recently, we've been funded by the MRFF as part of a collaboration with other colleagues in UQ to try and develop digital infrastructure to try and improve outcomes, perinatal outcomes for First Nations women. And we've also been funded to various extent by the NHMRC and the MRFF and other more local funding organizations. But before all this happened, we were really very fortunate, and I'm very, very grateful to MARTA Research and particularly MARTA Foundation for kickstarting the research endeavors within my group. So without their support, none of this would have been possible. So a little bit about the clinical trials. iSearch, fetal distress, where the baby becomes significantly compromised in labor, can happen without warning. It's usually due, as I said earlier, to placental dysfunction. And in 60% of cases, there is no obvious risk factor that is discernible either during the pregnancy or during labor. We know that small infants are at particular risk because the ability of a baby to withstand hypoxic challenge during labor largely depends on its metabolic and cardiac reserves. And to address some of these issues, we're running 2 randomized controlled trials, iSearch and RIDSTRESS here at the MARTA. iSearch really started off by a small phase 2 clinical study that we did at the MARTA Mothers Hospital, and we published this as a report of major impact in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology about 3 years ago, where we showed that women who were exposed to oral sildenafil or Viagra during labor had significantly lower emergency cesarean section rates for fetal distress, rates of meconium stain liquor, and abnormal fetal heart rate patterns were also significantly reduced. And Liam Dunn and Jessica Turner were 2 clinician PhD students who ran the trial at the MARTA. They've since got their PhDs and left. So on the back of these preliminary findings, we were very fortunate to be funded by the MRFF, and together with our partners at the University of Queensland, the Stilbert CRE, Cerebral Palsy Alliance, University of Sydney Clinical Trial Centre, we got this rather large amount to run a big clinical trial, randomized trial of almost 3,200 women in 16 Australian hospitals over 4 years. That trial is now up and recruiting. It took us about a year to get ethics and governance approvals, but it's up and running now. And we've now recruited or randomized almost more than 900 women, and it's recruiting pretty quickly. 730 of those women have come from the Mater Hospital. Several interstate hospitals are now up and running, and many more are going to come online within the next couple of months. So we're reasonably confident that in the next 14 months or so, we should have completed this trial, which would be a big achievement in itself, because pharma trials in pregnancy are notoriously difficult to do, let alone one in labor. So as I said, iSearch is funded by the MRFF, and a slightly smaller Queensland-centric trial, which stress true, again, very similar to iSearch, is funded by the RBWH Research Foundation, Mater Foundation, Cerebral Palsy Alliance, and the Ranscock Research Foundation. Following on from these clinical trials, and together with colleagues at the NHRC Clinical Trial Centre, our bigger vision is to undertake an IPD PMA of many smaller iSearch trials, both nationally and internationally, to address the question of whether or not sildenafil reduces adverse perinatal outcomes related to intrapartum hypoxia, and to see if it really makes a difference. You need very, very large numbers, and that's where this whole concept of an IPD PMA comes in. And this is really going to be led by William Tanamodi, who's a senior perinatal investigator at the Clinical Trial Centre, and Lene Seidler, who's a middle career statistician at the CTC, together with us here at Mater Research. Very excitingly, we've now received confirmation from the NICHD that they're going to fund a small pilot study in a low and middle income country of 500 women to see whether we can roll out iSearch in a sort of an abbreviated form to low and middle income settings to address this question of whether or not sildenafil really is of benefit in labor. So that's something that's happening in the future. And this is the bigger vision, where we hope to run a mega trial with, taking into account many separate trials in different settings. Currently, our group is involved in several national and international trials. C-Steroids, which is funded by the New Zealand Health Research Council, Proceed, funded by the NHMRC Clinical Trials and Cohort Studies. Protect Me is another very exciting trial run out of Monash University, looking at whether melatonin supplementation in women who have very growth-restricted babies makes a difference to neurodevelopmental outcomes. Another trial, SNACS, funded by the MRFF International Clinical Trials, and the Canadian Health Research is also due to start, and we're going to be one of the recruiting centers. And SEPRA, which is an ultrasound-based trial to look at ultrasound factors that might reduce the risk of stillbirth in women presenting with decreased fetal movements. And again, we're a major recruiting center for those. In terms of big data, we've partnered with an industry partner, Max Kelso, and together with other colleagues around the world, we hope to look at big perinatal data sets, and the Mater Research Perinatal Data Set is a very comprehensive resource. We've also got access to the Queensland perinatal data set of more than 1 million births. So we really have the power to look at using complex statistical methodology to look at factors that might help us identify and develop screening tests for some of these complications. Biomarkers, we're collaborating with basic science colleagues here at the TRI and around Australia. And we're running a prospective cohort study called the Prosper study together to look at and collect samples in a prospective manner from women with complicated pregnancies. And that's a study that's ongoing at the moment. In terms of student achievements, we've had lots of students who have completed their PhDs. Many have won awards, clinical awards, as well as biomedical awards. Chris Flatley, who was a statistician with our group and has completed his PhD, was selected as to a postdoctoral position to the Norwegian Genomics Institute, and he's now a senior research fellow. He's just come back to Queensland to the UQ Institute of Molecular Bioscience. So we're very proud of his achievements. We've had a decent number of publications over the last few years, and through the investigator grant that I received last year, I've managed to establish a fetal growth clinic at the Mater Centre for Maternal and Fetal Medicine, and have also recently been asked to write Queensland health guidelines for the management of pregnancies complicated by fetal growth restriction. A little bit about the fetal growth clinic. Started only in May this year, as I said, funded by the investigator grant. We've used the funds to employ a senior sonographer and a midwife. There's a PhD student, a clinical PhD student attached to this clinic, and we've very quickly attracted 200 new patients from many different hospitals within the Greater Brisbane area, but also more beyond that. And almost 80% of patients that are seen in this specialized fetal growth clinic are recruited into clinical research studies. So that's been a fantastic resource for us. And I think it's a good model of research clinical partnership within the organization. Our future work is to complete these two large clinical trials to increase our collaboration with other investigators locally, nationally, and internationally. Try and attract Category 1 funding wherever possible, and to attract high-quality clinical trials to the Mater. And I've given you some examples of these clinical trials. And our overarching goal, I guess, is to position Mater as Australia's preeminent perinatal research campus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sailesh. And thank you to all our senior researchers who talked today. I think it's given you a pretty good picture of how Mater research is not just about scientists sitting in their ivory towers playing with mice, but we are actually making a difference to patients, and both at the basic research level and at the clinical level. So thank you to all of our senior speakers. My last task today is to introduce the chair of our next session, and this is Dr. Yoon-Kyo Ahn. She's head of inflammatory bowel disease at Mater Hospital and the clinical lead of the IBD Clinical Trials Unit at Mater Research. She holds a senior lecturer position at the University of Queensland, and she's currently pursuing a PhD on top of all that. She's a passionate advocate for optimizing patient outcomes through a holistic approach to care. And that includes personalized treatment plans to manage digestive health and an incorporation of clinical and translational research in patient care. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Ahn. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Prof. Summers. What an inspirational meeting today. If anything, I learned one thing. We need another line on the mission. So discover, translate, integrate, but need money. So I think that's one thing that we all need to work through. But I'm honored to chair this session, which I think is a very exciting session where we announce the winners of the prestigious Sister of Mercy medals and recognizing those individuals who made outstanding contribution throughout the year. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor John Burke, who is the chairman of the Mater Medical Research Institute Development Council from 1994 to 1999. And I'd like to thank him for sharing history of Mater research with us today through this video interview. So we'll look at the video and come back again.
Well, I'd been on the board for a number of years. I considered that the clinical work in the Mater was very good, the morale was very good, and the administration was very good. And I thought, well, how can a board improve the institution? And I considered that we needed a research institute. Well, the Sisters of Mercy had a very major role. They've had a history of research since the early beginnings of this hospital.
Research had been going on at the Mater since probably the early 1920s, when a very enterprising Sister of Mercy, decided to purchase a second-hand microscope. Her name was Sister Mary Chanel England. She was one of these people who was into everything. She was a nurse educator, as well as doing some laboratory work for the hospital itself. In her spare time, she would do a bit of research. And it just grew from there.
I think when they first started it, they really wanted something that would complement the other things that MARTA were doing, but also recognising that a lot of research had already been undertaken over the years, but perhaps not in a coordinated fashion. So what they really wanted was something that addressed the aspects of the MARTA mission that only research could address.
It was not until about the 1990s they decided that it was high time the MARTA got much more coordinated about the research it was doing.
Our committee commenced in 1994 and the Institute was opened in March 1999 by the Governor-General of Australia. The major obstacles obviously is the financing of the Institute, but there was a tremendous amount of goodwill. Everybody wanted to work and work well, and the Sisters of Mercy were behind us with a large amount of money.
They tipped in $3 million. The MARTA Foundation was well set up to assist as well.
When Madonna Josie made the announcement of the major grant, immediately the CEO was Pat Maguire, Deputy CEO was Stan Walsh, and myself, we made an appointment to see Laurie Powell, who was the head of Queensland Institute of Medical Research. That was the only institute in Queensland at that stage, and he gave us this enormous welcome. He said that we need another institute in Brisbane. He said, it's great news. He said, I will support you. Oh, it was a great feeling here to see Derek Hart, who was the initial director of the Institute, with some of his scientists, with the Sisters of Mercy, the board members, other clinicians and the staff, and the Governor-General of Australia making the speech to open up the Institute. It was a great feeling.
Our growth in research activity was significant. We went, for example, over the years I was director, from roughly 40 publications per year to over 500, many in really top global ranking journals. And we were also able, through that activity, to attract a number of fellowships and major grants to the Institute, which of course is of terrific benefit to the actual researchers, both clinical and non-clinical researchers within the Institute.
I think we've exceeded the Sisters' expectations, because when they first started, we just had 8 scientists and the focus was on a particular cell in the body that was involved in the immune response to cancer. We now no longer just look at cancer. We've expanded. We look at a range of cancers, but also we have other pillars. For example, our mother and baby program, which has a particular focus on preventing stillbirths and on reducing perinatal mortality. We also have another program in chronic and integrated care, where we focus on diabetes and inflammatory bowel disease. And we have a major focus on neuroscience, with particular areas of excellence in epilepsy and in early onset dementia and autism. And our most recent program that we're particularly proud of was healthcare delivery and innovation, where we're looking at new and innovative ways to try and make the health system work together more seamlessly.
The key changes during my tenure as director was in 2013, when we formalised the relationship with the University of Queensland to form MARTA Research Institute UQ. By formalising that, we were able to increase our PhD student numbers very significantly, and also then became easier for clinicians across the hospital complex through MARTA Research to form a relationship and have an honorary appointment with the university, and so therefore maintain both their academic activities in alignment with their clinical activities.
I think if the people who were responsible at the time for setting up the Research Institute could see this, they'd sort of go, ooh, you know, we didn't realise it was going to get as big as this.
I just thought we were going to be a small institute in the MARTA, but realising that you need to amalgamate with other units, and that's what the MARTA has done with TRI now with the major laboratories.
It's very powerful for us to have research within the MARTA group, because it gives us something that's unique, and it's something that people actually want in a world-class hospital. They know that you get the best clinicians when you have research working arm in arm with the hospital. They know we need bright people who make discoveries which will actually give our patients the best healthcare outcomes.
The setting up of the Research Institute was like the last piece of the Mater jigsaw to make it a real world-class tertiary hospital that still carries on the Mater values.
And when we come here today, I never imagined we'd have an institute like this, you know. So it just went forward.
There was cooperation all the way around.
All the way through. We didn't have any antagonistic person whatsoever.
So it was really meant to happen.
Yes.
Where else would you rather be other than Mater Research, I guess? It is my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor John Burke to come to the stage, and he will hand over the Sisters of Medals to all the winners today. So while he's making his way down, the first medal that we will be awarding will be Sister Madonna Josie Medal. The Sister Madonna Josie Medal is awarded to an individual who has made an outstanding contribution to Mater research operations, including research support service, clinical services, and everyday operations. The nominees for the Sister Madonna Josie Medals, oh, it makes me palpitate. Okay. The nominees are Alice In, Dominic Williams, Megan Martin, Ranuk Prasad, Ruth Lee, and Stephanie Gulias. The winner is Megan Martin. However, we don't have Megan Martin here with us, so we'll ask the Professor Lucy Burke to come to the stage to get the medal. So Megan has been with Mater Research for over 17 years and applied her extensive clinical research experience to grow the Respiratory, Infectious Disease and Oncology, so-called RIO Clinical Trials Unit, as a coordinator, and Lucy is the lead on that. Her high standard and attention to safety have meant the RIO team has developed into a strong and capable unit. In addition to the managing her own duties, Megan has volunteered to support newer staff with hands-on training and is now helping one of Mater's small clinical trials teams to grow and achieve independence. Although she keeps low profile, she's always willing to share her extensive knowledge with others. Megan has truly been a team player in 2022. So again, can you join us to celebrate her winning? Next medal is Sister Regis Mary Dunn Medal. The Sister Regis Mary Dunn Medal is awarded to a Mater research individual who has made outstanding research contributions throughout the year. The nominees for this award is Associate Professor Jake Gratten, Associate Professor Jacob Bigan, and Dr. Catherine Irving, and Dr. Kylie Alexander. And the winner is Associate Professor Jake Gratten. Congratulations, Dr. Gratten. Please come up to the stage. Associate Professor Jake Gratten leads the Cognitive Health Genomic Group focused on advancing our understanding of psychiatric and neurological disorder through the analysis of big genomic data sets we all heard today. In the past year, Jake's group have published significant research findings, including work showing that autism-gut microbiome relationships are driven by restricted dietary preferences associated with autism spectrum disorders. Jake has published extensively in a high-impact journal, including Cell, Nature, Science, has attracted more than 8.5 million in research funding, and contributed to the Mater culture of inclusion, serving on equity, diversity, and inclusion committee, while also being a sought-after mentor for many junior Mater researchers. Congratulations. Next medal is Sister Maclean Ahern Medal. So the Sister Maclean Ahern Medal is awarded to a Mater research individual who has a track record of high quality performance relative to opportunity and has made outstanding contribution to student supervision. And we have two nominees for this medal. We've got Dr. Jacob Gratten and Associate Professor Kristen Redford. And the winner is Associate Professor Kristen Redford. Over the past 15 years, Professor Kristen Redford has successfully supervised 27 students, including 12 honor students, 10 of whom achieved Class 1, with 4 continuing on HDR student under Kristen's primary supervision. All 6 of Kristen's completed PhD students have been awarded competitive scholarship and travel awards, published in high quality first author research and review articles, and have been successfully employed in academia and industry. Kristen's supervision and training of so many successful students is to be highly commended. Thank you. Congratulations, Kristen. Last but not least, Sister Eileen Pollard Medal. This medal is awarded to a MARTA research individual who has been outstanding translating research into the provision of clinical care. And we have a lot of nominees for this one. So we have Associate Professor Jacob Bigan, Lewis Perrin, Lisa Luxo, Rohan Laurie, Simon Bowler, Sanders McCarthy, and Andrew Swain. And the winner is Professor Lewis Perrin. Professor Lewis Perrin clinical team have made a significant advances in the surgical treatment of endometrial, ovarian, and cervical cancers through focusing on the identification of molecular drivers of gynecological malignancies and the evaluation of new diagnostic and therapeutic strategies. His quiet persistence with and encouragement of researchers have greatly increased the sophistication of gynecological cancer research at MARTA. Lewis personifies the MARTA value of promoting the dignity of human life, compassion, and integrity and excellence. And through his many contributions to both clinical practice and research, he promotes the MARTA vision of improving patient life through enhanced health and well-being. Congratulations, Prof. Lewin. Please join me to thank Associate Professor Joan Burke one more time, who did excellent work on awarding the medals. And now, after the photo session, I'd like to hand over to Professor Maya Gandhi. I don't know whether it was just me, but every single important occasion, he wears his salmon pink shirt. And it was in every video, and he didn't forget to wear it today. So he will be awarding Betty McGrath Seating Grant outcomes for today. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to announce the Betty McGrath Foundation Awards. These are quite unique to MARTA research. They're designed to enhance the research capability of MARTA research in combination with MARTA Health and MARTA Education. We have seeding grants provided in the areas of healthcare delivery and innovation. This is a new program of ours, and we deliberately made that strategic decision to try and expand that program. The idea is to improve the delivery of care provided to patients and the welfare of healthcare workers caring for patients. And in partnership with MARTA Education, we have seeding grants designed to improve the methods to provide and evaluate clinical education within that ministry. In a competitive field of 14 applications, 5 seeding grants were awarded. The 2022 awardees are Associate Professor Anne Liditsky, Professor Vicky Clifton, Dr. Jennifer Utter, Dr. Ruben Beer, and the Education awardee is Mr. Rohan Bates. Please join me in congratulating them. Okay, so that just leaves me to make a few closing remarks. Firstly, I'd like to thank Farhana, Sarah, John, also Sarah and members of the ERMI team, and also those who helped within TRI in creating this event, which I'm sure you'll agree ran very well, and I certainly learned a lot of things as well as being very entertained. I'd like to thank again our keynote speaker, Anne Kelso, and I'd like to welcome you all to join us for some refreshments outside. And thank you all for attending this event. Thank you.